Avatar: The Last Airbender is a beautifully animated show with illustrations that make me tear-bend, both from an awe-inspiring standpoint and from a whatever this is. That's right, for this video, I'm going to be attempting to remaster the GAang journeying to Kiyoshi Island to ride the giant koi fish before getting interrupted by the
Unagi.
Our first shot of the day features a wide view of the beach that Aang and the GAang find themselves upon. I'm super envious of this because it's been getting really hot where I am, and I would give anything to jump in this Unagi-infested seawater. Moving along from that tangent, I matched the sea and the sand on the shore before moving on to the rocks and the sky in the background. Luckily, the image stays perfectly still on the side, so there wasn't much that needed to be done after this initial drawing. The very next scene is more of the same as Sokka and his younger sister Katara look upon Aang with bewilderment on their faces. I dragged the frame over to the right side of the canvas as I filled out the mountain and the sky in the back. Again, this is a perfectly still image in the show, so that it makes my job as easy as possible. The following shot from the show has our characters looking upon the big koi fish. It's similar enough to the previous shots where I had to finish the sides consisting of the water, the sand, the rocks, and the sky. However, an added task includes drawing in the water as it moves back and forth from the sea to the shore. I color matched the water and drew in the remaining frames, and once that portion was completed, I knew I couldn't forget about best boy Momo trotting along the sand. Aw, he's so cute. Now, normally I would mark this scene as complete and move on to the next one, but I felt that the image still had that 4:3 aspect ratio feeling just from the way the characters were placed. So I wanted to try doing an additional trick to break up that feeling. I used the selection tool to mark areas around Katara and Sokka and move them away from the center to give that 16:9 frame some more room to breathe. The next step included filling out the rest of Momo's body since Katara's head and Sokka's big elephant ears covered bits of Momo. This was a somewhat tedious process, but I'm glad I did it. Looking at it again after a few days, I realized that I may have made Katara and Sokka stand a bit too far from each other. Let me know down below if I should have just kept it the same or if I should have done something a bit differently. I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Moving along, we have Aang doing his best Michael Phelps impression, or Pak Tae-hwan for all you Koreans out there, as he dives into the water. I made sure to complete the background first before working on the water as the little splashes move around quite a bit. I keyframed the additional background pieces to move alongside the original camera, and here's a quick little test to see how it turned out. I think it looks pretty good, so I knew that it was my sign to move on ahead with the waves. Not gonna lie, this was a bit annoying to do, but I was just thankful I hadn't run into another scene on the level of that Zuko one from the prior video. Sheesh, that one was bad. Anyways, the water actually didn't take an insane amount of time like I thought it would, and before I knew it, I was done. The next scene is Aang hanging onto the koi fish as he emerges from the water. And it wouldn't be a video from yours truly if there wasn't a scene where I forgot to hit record. Luckily, I noticed sooner than later and was able to capture most of the process. I completed the background and was in the process of finishing the splashes and the waves. This took a long time with how many different frames there are of the fish moving around. I also didn't like how the background turned out, so I decided to remove it and focus on the waves first, before putting my full attention to that sole rock that exists only to make my job more difficult. Afterwards, I worked on the inking of the fish, and here's how the unfinished product looks. I don't want it to sound like I'm tooting my own horn, but I think it looks pretty decent. I finished working on the coloring and moved on to the next sequence. We have yet another reaction shot of Sokka and Katara, and yet again I moved them over to the right side of the screen so I can get most of the mountain and the sky. Now, you may be asking why I simply didn't just copy and paste the background from the earlier frame into this one to save on time, and all I can say is, that's a really good question. Anyways, here's the first grouping of scenes all together. Let me know how they turned out. Although these initial scenes weren't too complicated, I'm quite pleased with how they all turned out so far. I'm not the biggest fan of how the water looks in some scenes, but that's just a skill issue, and I know I need to practice more to improve. Also, if you're enjoying this video so far, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, as I'll really appreciate it. The next scene features a closer look at Aang and the koi fish. This must be one of them fancy color changing fish cause it seems to vary quite a bit from scene to scene. All I had to do for this scene was to finish outlining the remaining scales and fins before ultimately coloring them in. And just like how Sean Evans prepares the last stab by shaking the hot sauce, I had to do the same to these scales. By that I mean just shaking them around to match the original animation. The analogy sounded a lot better in my head, I'm sorry for that. Let's zoom on ahead and out as we have another wide shot but from a higher viewpoint. I did something similar to the prior scene with pushing Katara and Sokka away from the center, and pushed these rocks off to the side to give more space to the scene up above. I added more land to the rocks on the left and right of the image and also expanded the sky to fit the rest of this 16:9 world. This was a very relaxing scene that was very quickly undone by the next sequence. Here we have Aang and his color-changing magic fish underwater. First order of business was to extend the water. Because of the specific gradients of the water, okay, I feel like I'm saying that word way too much. Because of the specific gradients of the agua, I made sure to extend each frame using the original image individually. This dihydrogen monoxide never looked better in my opinion. It was smooth sailing on this salt-infested liquid scene until we reached the moment Aang and his magic koi fish reached the end of the old 4x3 world and into the new 16:9 one. Once we got to this point, I made sure to fill out the outlines and color them in. Luckily, this only took place near the end of the scene. The next scene features Katara and Sokka yet again, but this time the image is zoomed out a bit to show the water. The foundation of this scene is the same as the other ones. It's the same sky with the same mountains and the same sand. The only animating I had to accomplish in this section came from the little waves. This scene wouldn't have been so bad if it weren't for the fact that my neck was hurting quite a bit due to my posture. I know I said I don't want to end up like Coraline's dad, but at this rate, in 20 years, I might end up like Coraline's dad. Wiping that thought from my mind, we stumble upon this shot of Aang smiling at Katara and Sokka. Well, mainly Katara. I outlined the fish and colored it in before pulling the last stab so I can shake it around to match the motion of the original cartoon. Next, we have the shot of Katara leaving the scene due to something Appa's doing off screen. I widened the image and made a selection of Katara as she goes behind the background. I did it this way to avoid having the camera match the image because lazy. However, at the time of recording the voiceover part, which is this part right now, I realized that there's a layer in Clip Studio Paint called a camera layer that will let me drag the camera across as the scene plays out. Instead of trying to move it manually frame by frame, I could just use this layer, and it definitely would make scenes easier in the future. Anyways, once I got done working on Katara, I quickly shifted my focus to the water at the bottom. I thought by now I would be fine animating water, but it's still as tedious and annoying as ever. Really good thing this season isn't solely focused on water. We're jumping a bit ahead to this next shot where Aang and his two other fish buddies are swimming along where they get met with a giant creature lurking underneath the water.
There's always a bigger fish.
Luckily, there doesn't seem to be much happening on the edges here, so after completing the sea, my job was practically done. Unfortunately, my job wasn't actually done. For this water-infested clip, I used the existing image to fill in most of the background while I focus on the waves at the bottom. Since these consist of two main shades, I decided to work on them individually. Here's how the next portion of scenes all turned out. We're about 2/3 done with the video, and I can say that this attempt was a lot less headache-inducing than the Zuko vs Xiao one for the previous video. I'm quite happy with how these second portions of scenes turned out, at least compared to the first, and I'm more than ready to move on to the final portion where we get Aang's interaction with the koi fish and that legendary shot of Aang running away. Aang is surfing on the fish without a care in the world. You know, it's just the fate of the entire world on his hands as 100 Years' Wars is reaching the penultimate climax as Hosen's comet inches ever so closely towards utter annihilation. But come on, that's just a problem for future Aang. I finished working on the blue floor below and moved onto the water splashing across the screen. The sky came next as it slowly made its way down, and I thought the scene was good enough to be marked complete, but after taking a longer look at it, I wasn't really feeling it. I really should stop taking a longer look at things. To avoid making it feel like a 4x3 scene, I feel like I moved it too far to the left. To remedy the situation, I simply moved everything over to the right a little bit and filled out the new empty spaces. Personally, I think this looks a lot better than this, but let me know down below which one you prefer. Our next section of the show features Aang waving unknowingly before he gets flung from his fish. As always, I dragged the image to the left side and got to work. I did the water and the sky relatively quickly before getting the outline of the koi fish done. After that, I simply colored in the remaining pieces. The fish does some minor shaking, so I made sure to keyframe it before moving on to the rest of the scene. The waves were next, and before I knew it, I found myself flung onto the next scene, kinda like Aang here. Aang is mid-air to start this scene, and while he's just hanging there, I made sure to fill out the rest of the canvas. Due to the camera's moving nature, I had to do the extra step of keyframing the background. Luckily, it was a very smooth motion, so it didn't take too long. After that, I just had to add in little splashes of water from Aang's violent entrance into the surface. I first wanted to work on the outline to see how it would look overall, and here is that shot. I was pleased with the result, so I knew it was time to move on ahead with the coloring. The coloring was relatively simple and straightforward, and I was having a good time with this scene. The next shot is a close-up to wide shot, and I originally had no idea how I was going to do this, but luckily it was at this point that I discovered the camera layer in the animation section of the toolbar up above. Using this layer plus the keyframe tool, I was able to create a consistent and smooth zoom on the wide image. After the zooming was completed, I worked on animating the rest of the shadow in the water. I also realized at the time of recording and editing, aka now, that I forgot to add the little shading from the original, so I do apologize for that fact. The next scene was another simple one and another one where I utilized the camera layer. I'm so glad I was able to find out about this feature. Anyways, I colored in the sides. The right side had nothing really going on, so it was a simple process. The left side, although just as simple, had the added challenge of finishing the shadow moving along the water. Once we get further along the scene, there are splashes of water coming from Aang as he finally notices a giant Unagi staring him down. I worked on these splashes with minor difficulty before moving on to my new best friend, the camera layer. I used this layer to simply zoom into Aang's glorious face. Aang's fight or flight reaction kicked in, and we can clearly see which option he ended up choosing. To save on time, I copy and pasted the existing image, flipped it, and then drew on top of it to finish the background. Aang must have learned how to walk on water from Master Jiraiya himself, because we see him zooming away in Looney Tunes fashion. I then drew and colored in the Unagi as it decides to follow Aang on his little run. This was a very fun scene to work on, and it's the predecessor to the most iconic scene of this episode, and probably my favorite scene in the entire show, just because of how Aang looks. I mentioned before that Avatar: The Last Airbender is a show with extremely amazing visuals, and this is no exception. I knew the attention would be mainly on Aang himself, so I quickly used the actual frame to fill in the background. Anyways, this shot is for all you foot people. This chaotic scene was also quite chaotic to work on. There was just so much going on in each frame, and I think I've seen Aang's foot more times than I can count, but I finally finished this masterpiece of a shot, and we're finally moving on to the final shot of our video. It won't be an episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender without showcasing Sokka getting absolutely destroyed for no reason, and this video will be no exception. We'll be moving the frame yet again. The background was also another of the same mountain, sky, and sands, but this time we had Aang. After his hit to Sokka, there's a trail of dust left behind, so I finished those loose ends, and after all of that was done, I was finally done. Let's take a look at all of the scenes we've worked on combined. This video took me quite a while, mainly due to how many scenes I worked on, but also due to me getting sick and being out of commission for a bit. I was happy to learn about the camera layer, as I can foresee that being very helpful for future videos, whether they be on Avatar or for something else. I do think I'm getting the hang of this animation software more with this little remaster project I'm working on. I do gain so much more respect for animators after doing this project. After all, I'm just adding onto a scene. I can't imagine having to create something from scratch. But that would also be quite fun to try in the future. It's also crazy to think that I've been making videos for a year now as I passed the 1-year mark of my channel's creation. It's crazy to me, at least. Thank you so much for the support. I really appreciate. Yeah, and I hope you all enjoyed watching this video. Please don't forget to leave a like if you haven't already. Please comment down below if you enjoyed it, and also please subscribe if you want to see more videos from yours truly, whether they be more Avatar Remaster videos, other art project challenge videos, or simply me talking about movies like I used to before I went down this Avatar Remaster rabbit hole. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye.